I feel very called to become a member of the Catholic Church.
Love the Catholic Church. It's just the best place to be.
From the studios of EWTN, this is Open Line. In North America, call toll-free 1-833-288-EWTN. That's 1-833-288-3986. Outside North America, call 1-205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000 or send an email to openline@ewtn.com.
Well, welcome to the Friday edition of Open Line. I'm Colin Donovan, Vice President for Theology here at EWTN, and your usual person on the Friday Open Line. We were going to have a EWTN Theology Roundtable, which has been postponed till next Friday due to sickness in the Theology Department. So please pray for all Theology Department members as we struggle through this cold and flu season and all the things which follow on from that. So with those prayers would be appreciated. So we're going to take questions today live. We will be live, and so you can call us here if you're in North America. We have a toll-free number, 1-833-288-EWTN. That's 1-833-288-3986. Or if you're outside North America, in England or Europe or on a boat in the Pacific, 1-205-271-2985. That's country code 1-205-271-2985. And, of course, in this social and electronic media age, we have a plethora of ways to contact us, including by text message through your smart device, by texting EWTN at 55000. Wait for us to respond, and then text your first name and your question, and that will make it to our Jeff Burson in social media here, working with us here on the radio today, and he'll get that question into me. And also, if you're watching on EWTN.com or on the EWTN app, or if you're watching on the EWTN Radio Facebook page or the EWTN YouTube channel, through those latter two social medias, Facebook and YouTube, you can also send a question through them as well. So lots of ways to contact us, and so looking forward to a lot of good questions today. Well, let's see about an email question here, and this comes from Misty, who asks, please explain to me how the ordinary magisterium exercises itself as an organ of infallibility when it does and does not speak infallibly. One of the questions I have is, when does the teaching of this kind fit into the degree of assent we should exercise in believing it? I've heard it said that religious obedience or obsequium of the mind and will must be exercised in cases of ordinary magisterial infallibility. Please explain what that means. Well, we actually have, I think, three kinds of questions built into that. One is the occasions when the supreme magisterium exercises its supreme authority in defining something as being a question of the faith, a matter of the faith. The examples of that obviously are when ecumenical councils, in other words, the College of the Bishops in union with a pope, and a council can't operate independent from a pope, decrees a certain teaching, such as the Lateran Council or Chalcedon or Ephesus or Constantinople or Vatican I, where they define a certain teaching as being revealed by God, and they bind the Christian faithful to accepting it on that basis. In other words, by making an act of theological faith, supernatural faith, with regard to that particular teaching. And this is completely appropriate because our belief in God, as St. Thomas Aquinas tells us, includes, first of all, God himself, the fact that he is God and we are not, and so on, and all the things related to God, but necessarily propositions, true things which can be said about God and seen to be having been revealed by him on his authority. So sometimes those things are patent in sacred scripture. Sometimes they take a declaration of the church to make them clear, typically when there's error. And that declaration can be made by the supreme magisterium of a council acting in union with the Pope, or by the supreme magisterium of a Pope defining in some respect a particular teaching. And when that magisterium operates in that way, we have the guarantee that it is not only true, but it's infallibly true. Now, that does not limit these things which are of divine faith and Catholic faith, in other words, patently revealed by God or revealed and declared such by the Church. That doesn't limit the things which are true. The Church happily goes along for centuries believing that certain things are true and expecting Catholics to believe it, and takes for granted that they do. There's no question about it. And this is what the ordinary magisterium does. There's no infallible act, there's no declarative act or defining act, but time going on, it's quite clear, for example, as popes have pointed out with regard to the ordination of men to the priesthood, or as Paul VI pointed out with regard to humanae vitae, contraception, or as John Paul II pointed out, that with regard to the question of life and whether it is morally wrong, gravely wrong to kill the innocent, and he defined that in three different ways, by defining the commandment, defining abortion as a violation of the commandment, and euthanasia. Now, it's not that these have been widely disputed throughout the ages. In fact, they were held always and everywhere and by all. This is sort of the basis of which we can judge something is part of the ordinary infallible magisterium. It's always been taught as such. It's been taught by every teacher of the Church without rebuke for however many generations or even the past 2 millennia. It's been taught everywhere where the faith has been brought as true. We can't suddenly say, for example, that fornication is now licit because the Church has not defined it infallibly by some supreme act that intercourse outside marriage is fine and good and dandy. Doesn't have to. It's taught by the infallible ordinary magisterium to be grave moral fault, to contain grave matter, and to be an act of such type would be objectively a grave sin. And you can multiply the cases there. I mentioned women's ordination. That's settled, that the Pope would, John Paul VI before him, and John Paul II, and even Pope Francis have simply repeated this teaching, only adds to the burden of its truthfulness. It is the teaching of the Church. It's not been counter-taught by anyone in any age, in any place, who was not identified as such by somebody dissenting against Church teaching and rebuked as such, as has happened in our own era. So that is the infallible ordinary magisterium. The many, many, many things about the faith that have always been taught and everywhere been taught, and by all Catholic teachers, both magisterial teachers, the bishops and popes, but also by theologians and others, as constituting part of the patrimony of the faith. And it's a rather extensive list. You almost have to ask the question, is this particular thing always everywhere and by all been taught as such? And if the answer is yes, it's infallibly true. The Church isn't going to reverse something and say, oh, we've been wrong for 2,000 years, and the hundreds and thousands of doctors and theologians and popes and bishops who have taught it are all wrong and we're right. That would make no logical sense. That's because it's an infallible teaching. It can't be overturned. So this is the kind of way that we know that it is. And then finally, the other point is regarding the obsequium and religious obedience of intellect and will. These things are a little bit more difficult to ferret out because they're usually in the gray areas where something is not defined. Taking an example of, and what is being asked in that case, as Vatican II and Lumen Gentium pointed out, Lumen Gentium 25, was being asked, is deference of the intellect and the will to what is being taught, usually by the Pope, since that's the case the Council cited, with regard to an area which is a developing area of doctrine. I like to use the case of St. Joseph. There have been historically two opinions regarding whether St. Joseph was an older guy who had maybe other children by a first wife, or whether he was a young man who married Mary, and into which, of course, the incarnation occurred. Now, in the East, there had been the opinion of the older man, and this is represented in various stories and various discussions of fathers. But in the West, it's generally been the opinion of the young virginal Joseph. Time going on, this is more and more being the conclusion of theologians and by the papal magisterium itself, going back to the 1800s and specifically to John Paul II. This would be an opinion to which we should give deference. It's a tendency of the magisterium, the papal magisterium, that is clear but not defined. We should respect it and not oppose it and counter it, certainly through public discourse and public means. That would be an example of such a case. Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll take your questions. I'll give you those numbers quickly again. 1-833-288-EWTN. That's 1-833-288-3986. And if you're outside North America, country code 1-205-271-2985. Back in a moment to take your questions.
This is Dr. Ray Guarendi, host of The Doctor Is In.
This is Bishop Robert Barron of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. Have a blessed Easter from all of us at EWTN Radio.
How about this? Apple TV allows you to instantly stream EWTN to your TV. Get EWTN today. It's easy. All you need is a high-speed internet connection, a TV, and the Apple TV player.
Father Benedict Groeschel.
I often go back to my childhood. In church, we love to be reverent, to Christ present in the Eucharist, to Christ on the cross. But I was also impressed by our sisters who taught us in school to pray before every class, to pray for what we needed. Because we could be irreverent, we were taught to go to confession on Saturday and to ask ourselves, did we say our prayers well and without distraction? All this was reverence. Now what do I see? I hear one irreverence after another. And week after week, month after month, the media churns out things that make fun of religion in general and make fun of Christianity in particular, and particularly make fun of the Catholic Church. No class. Absolutely no class.
The leading Catholic voices are on EWTN Radio.
This is Open Line on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. If you have a question or comment, call 1-833-288-EWTN. That's 1-833-288-3986. Outside North America, call 1-205-271-2985. Or send an email to openline@EWTN.com.
Well, we're back, and let's go to our first caller. We've got Frank listening in Illinois. Good afternoon, Frank.
Yes.
Yeah, you're on the air. Go ahead. What's your question today?
It's a series of two questions, basically. I understand that God is all-knowing. He knows everything in the past, everything in the future, and everything present. So my question is, if he knows everything, then why did he make Adam and Eve knowing they would sin?
Well, look at it this way. If God is the only perfect being in the universe, on what basis would he have created anything? On what basis, as a parent, would we procreate if we, knowing the likelihood, human nature being what it is, that our children would sin and maybe even come to very bad ends, would we procreate? So it's sort of the wrong question. The question is that since God is, or the answer would be, or maybe the proper question would be, why did he love what he created, even knowing that what he created would be imperfect and not like him? In the case of material things, his sharing of himself, his love, if you will, works infallibly. We know this about the natural law. You can't step off a tall building and expect to be able to violate the law of gravity. It works. It works consistently. It works everywhere with all of the qualifications a physicist would give about, the force of gravity near different bodies and massive bodies and so on. But we know that it works. So nature is rather infallible and in that way perfectly reflects the will of God and the design of God in loving into existence the laws of nature and the things of nature and so on and so forth. But it's also then true that, in creating the angels and then after that human beings, since he created them with the power to reject truth and to act on only what things are apparently good and not real goods, why did he do that? Well, for the same reason that although he knows every creature and every act that they will do, the good angels and the bad, and how those decisions worked out, and human beings, good and bad, and how those decisions will work out for eternity, he nonetheless creates them, because not create them would be an act similar to a parent saying, eugenically, I'm only going to create children that are perfectly healthy, perfectly intelligent, and going to be perfectly moral and ethical, without any freedom, would be what they'd be doing. I'm creating a set of conditions which really is not free, but is this moral straitjacket that restricts freedom in such a way that it's the only choice. The choices I want the creature to make are the only choices they can make. And that wouldn't be loving. So knowledge is not the greatest thing. Love is the greatest thing. So the natural world follows that because it works according to the laws given it. We're not so straightforward. We're not so moral or ethical, if you will, because we have the freedom to say no to the laws that God has built into us, written on our hearts, as Jesus would say with regard to the moral law, as the church would say with regard to the way the natural law works in us, as there to be discovered by our reason as sort of our operating principles, our operating manual. Do this, you'll be happy and fruitful. Don't do the opposite, and you'll bring trouble to yourself, to those who love you, to culture, society, and so on and so forth. So, knowing all the risks, he gave us existence and freedom as human parents give their children's existence and freedom through procreation, because although we don't have the power to give grace and opportunities to our children necessarily that God can do, we do know and believe that God is always and everywhere working to bring the freedom of his children to the right decisions that lead eventually to him and the eternal happiness he will provide as a reward for fidelity. The sad fact is, many of those very same children of God the Creator will not respond to those opportunities of grace in freedom, and will not then have that eternal happiness he destined them for. So it's more about love than it is about knowing, and I think that's a good way to look at. If we're only looking for things that are necessarily true and always in corresponding to that can only be brought by constraint and not by freedom. Love allows the freedom that the act of loving in return is also free. And we wouldn't want it any other way, and neither does God. Does that help?
I think it's still kind of vague because I still hear questions or responses like that.
Mm-hmm.
Saying, well, God had never intended for man to fall. God wants a relationship, et cetera, et cetera. But to me, it's vague. I mean, either God purposed that man should fall or he didn't purpose that man should fall. And that's what I'm trying to...
Well, he doesn't purpose. That's Calvinism. So he doesn't purpose it. He gives freedom. Freedom is choice, and choice means I can purpose it that way. I can purpose getting to God by the means that are available to me, or deciding I'm more interested in something temporal and in this world, even though it may cost me getting to God, or even to disbelieve in God, as some do. So that's just an intrinsic characteristic of the freedom we've been given. And he doesn't, when the church uses the expression of predestination, it's not a predestination of constraint, like God arbitrarily says, this one is saved, this one is to fall. No, he will give the graces necessary, even though he knows that one will choose not to take them. And I think the parent analogy works there because as a parent, you learn that, you have to give your children increasingly freedom, otherwise they do not get their wings, so to speak. And so freedom, unfortunately, comes with possibility of negative consequences. The difference between God and us is he knew that and still gave it because in loving us, he loved us into existence, even knowing that our existence will be good even if our moral choices are bad. But it is a deep and lofty subject, so I understand your difficulty, and many have pondered that over the millennia, both Christians and non-Christians and believers and non-believers. But that's how the church looks at it in any case. Well, let's go to Marcia in Fort Wayne, Indiana, listening on Redeemer Radio. Good afternoon, Marcia.
Hi.
Hi
Thank
there.
you for taking my call.
Sure.
I have just finished RCIA, but was not able to take the sacraments on Easter this year because of things that I have going on through the tribunal.
Mm-hmm.
But my husband doesn't understand why I want to be a Catholic. Now, I have learned more about the Bible than I have in all my years as a Christian. I've read more of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
I was given a sponsor when I first decided to join the church and could call her 24 hours a day, 7 days a week if I wanted to. And
I hope you didn't test that with the 2 a.m. phone call, but...
No. No, but she has gotten 7 a.m. phone calls.
Well, that's tolerable.
But I'm wondering, how do I get my husband to understand that I want to be Catholic?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I could give you a textbook's answer. You'll have to provide your own, personal answer. A lot of people become Catholic because they have a hole in their heart, sort of like St. Augustine, who, said our hearts are restless until we find our rest in you, O God. Some people have a thirst for truth and knowledge, and they read and intellectualize their way into the church, and they find it so intellectually satisfying to have a synthetic worldview that doesn't disdain culture and a legitimate role of politics and science and so on, so forth, that is really holistic in that sense. So everybody's going to have a different personal reason. I think from that angle you can speak from your heart as to what you think on a personal level that brings you. I mean, obviously, as Catholics, I'm more or less a lifelong Catholic, baptized as a child, so not exactly perfectly lifelong, but pretty much so. And you know, when you see, even if it's not on a profound intellectual level, that the church understands man and understands man's need for God and has been a reliable conduit of divine revelation, that if there is a God, he would provide a way that all human beings everywhere would in history find him. And the Catholic Church is the only instrument that suits that bill. It's otherwise just a club that satisfies certain particular needs. But the Church is a universal satisfier. And that, for me, I think would be a good answer. But you'll have your own personal one, I'm sure.
Mother Angelica. She took a leap of faith, and the world was never the same. Join EWTN and the Franciscan Missionaries of the Eternal Word as we honor our foundress and offer prayers of thanksgiving for her life and service, abandoned totally to the will of the Father. From Our Lady of the Angels Chapel, the Holy Mass in memoriam of Mother Angelica's passing, Tuesday at 8 a.m. Eastern, here on EWTN.
Tell the boss you have every right to disconnect. Hi, I'm Teresa Tamia with another Media Minute here on EWTN. A proposed law in New York City aiming to give employees the right to disconnect from their phones and emails without the fear of being fired. That law, proposed by a New York City councilman, would make it illegal for a company to require employees to access work email and other communications when they're off the clock. It applies to regular time off, sick days, and vacation time. If a violation is found, the employer could pay a city fine of $250 and an additional fine of $500 that will be given to the employee. The councilman hoping to pass the law by the end of the year. I'm Teresa Tamio with another Media Minute on EWTN.
The wisdom of Mother Angelica.
I said to the sisters one day, what do you think you're going to look like in heaven? Oh, some of them had absolutely magnificent ideas. I didn't think of one of them. And so I got desperate because then my turn came. I didn't know what to say. And so in desperation, I said, what do you think I'll wear in heaven? And they all said with one voice, armor.
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.
Hi, this is Dr. David Andrews. If you just don't understand something about the Catholic faith, Call to Communion is the show for you. Join us Monday at 2 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio. Now back to Open Line with Colin Donovan.
This is Open Line on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. If you have a question or comment, call 1-833-288-EWTN. That's 1-833-288-3986. Outside North America, call 1-205-271-2985 or send an email to openline@ewtn.com.
Okay, we're back. And I might mention, too, you can text us on your smart device at 55000. That's 55000. Wait for us to respond and then send us your first name and your question. So that and our Facebook and YouTube channel pages are all different ways you can send in a question to us. Well, let's take a YouTube question here, and Diana asks, "How do you feel the church is doing in leading by example to the young adults of our generation?" This is a good question. I mean, if you look at, we've had the sex abuse scandals. We've had sometimes shaky responses to those on the part of the hierarchy. We've had other, difficulties and confusions in recent years. And in all of that, it seems like, some response is given, but not always a firm one and satisfying one. And we tend to forget that the church in all ages has been beset by a very difficult and intractable problem, and that is fallen human nature. We all struggle to fulfill our vocational responsibilities with God's help, often with a lot of human respect in whatever position we hold in the church, our families, and elsewhere. It's easy to lose sight of the role that God and the church should have in all of this and to not fulfill what we're supposed to do completely and as perfectly as we should. And so I think there's no question that the church has had many defects in setting the example. But the church has also had many successes. I think when you look at the example of Pope John Paul II in his teaching and his enthusiasm for young people, this sparked a generation, and we're still benefiting and in many ways just starting to benefit from the fruits of the John Paul II generation and the Benedict XVI generation. And I'm sure there will be a Francis generation, too, of young people interested in coming up with pastoral responses to the pastoral needs of people. So we can find in each of our church leaders, our pope, our bishops, and so on, our local clergy and pastors, very many fine examples of enthusiasm to evangelize the young and to send the young out to evangelize other young people. So the trouble with our human nature is that alongside the good example, there's often bad examples. And so we have to remember that. And most importantly, we can't be scandalized by it. There's something you don't hear people talking about very much, and that is people often use the word scandal when they're talking about, say, the sex abuse scandal or other things. Oh, so-and-so did something that was scandalous, and to scandalize, which means to lead others into sin. And yes, all of our sins are capable of scandalizing. If somebody sees us not speaking the truth about something, fudging on our taxes or fudging in our employer relationships with that, they can say, well, if Joe can do that, I can do that too, and why not? He got away with it, I'll get away with it. And that's what scandal does. It breeds the idea that, well, there's a behavior that seems to be successful. I'm going to do that, even though it's not the right behavior. And this can happen in the church or anywhere. But there's another side to scandal, which St. Thomas Aquinas calls passive scandal, and that is that we sit around looking to find scandal, to passively be scandalized. He says that the saints never had this kind of scandal. Of course, they never had the giving of scandal either, the active scandal. But they never had the passive scandal because they knew, to use the old cliche, there but for the grace of God go I. So we shouldn't take passive scandal about the weaknesses and defects of our church leaders, our family leaders, whomever they are. Taking scandal doesn't accomplish anything. It's sinful. It's wrong. Giving scandal is more wrong, but taking it can also be wrong. If it motivates us to do something, to speak the truth, to give appropriate fraternal correction to those who need it, that's a good thing. This is what charity requires us to do. But to simply be scandalized by bad example in the church is not. I would rather be motivated by good example. And there are plenty of the examples of good. There are plenty of good examples out there in the universal church, in our dioceses, in our parishes. And let's be motivated by those rather than scandalized, in quotes, by human nature, fallen human nature, functioning as fallen human nature tends to do. Let's go. We have another question from Rudy, who asks, where did the souls of the dead go before Christ's death? Well, this is a question a lot of people wonder because we know about heaven, hell, and purgatory, but in fact, before Christ died and rose again and ascended to the Father, there was no place for the good to go. except that they went where, as St. Luke tells us in his gospel, Jesus uses this term in the parable, the bosom of Abraham. So he was using what was understood by the Jews, the theology as it had developed until that day, that there was the place of the dead. It was below the earth. There was the place where the patriarchs went, the bosom of Abraham, and there was the place where the bad people went. Okay, and generally it was called the lower regions, the infernum. It could be called hell in Latin, and from English we get that out of it. The Hades or Sheol in Hebrew. And so the dead went into the earth, and their spirits remained according to their merits in the bosom of Abraham or in Gehenna, the place of punishment. And so this is where the patriarchs, this is where the saints of the old law, from Adam and Eve down to Joseph and St. John the Baptist, and any who died during the years of Jesus' public ministry, up until the time of his ascension into heaven. It is where Jesus went to preach to the souls in prison, a prison from which they were imminently about to be released. So this is where they went, and this is where they remained, and then when he entered into heaven and took his place at the right hand of the Father, they accompanied him as sort of his triumph, his trophies, to use the language of the Romans, who would have their great triumphs, as you see in the movie Ben-Hur, where the general or admiral in that case comes in and brings in all his captured people and so on, and the spoils of war that he has won by the service of the emperor. Well, the souls of the dead who were just are the spoils won by Christ, and he took them with him when he went to heaven. Let's go to David in Birmingham, Alabama, listening on Guadalupe Radio. Good afternoon, David.
Hello, David Diakin here.
Yeah, go ahead. What's your question today?
Okay, my question is, I was listening to Catholic Answers one day, and someone had asked, what essentially did Christ do on the cross for us? And their understanding, coming from a Protestant background, as I did as well, was that Christ paid a debt which we as fallible sinners could not pay for our sins.
Mm-hmm.
And in the sense, it was a substitutionary death, took God's death sentence in our place. And the answer to that question was, no, it wasn't that God needed retribution, and so this was visited on Christ instead of us, that what Christ did was an act of atonement, which, honestly, I don't totally understand that response.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it still seems like, in a sense, as the old hymn says, that we owed a debt we could not pay, and he paid a debt he did not owe. So in a sense, it still seems like he is a substitution in our place. And I just wanted to see what your response to that was.
Well, there are different theories, certainly among theologians, fathers and doctors of the church, regarding explaining that. I think there's going to be two elements here. If you think of the things that Christ himself said during his public ministry, that he did not come to do away with the law, but to fulfill it, to perfect it. And the church understands that as charity perfects justice, it doesn't mean that justice is no more, that, love and do what you will of St. Augustine means, love and be promiscuous or decadent or whatever, and because you love, it's going to be excused of you. It doesn't mean that at all. It means that the person who truly loves and has a properly ordered love fulfills the law, fulfills justice. So I think it's a question of emphasis. Did Christ come down to earth to satisfy justice, or did he come down as an extension of the creative love I talked about at the beginning of the program? God created us out of love, knowing that in our human fallibility as necessarily imperfect creatures because we're finite and not God, we're going to fail. Some number of us are going to fail. Adam and Eve did from the get-go. They thankfully recovered and are numbered among the saints of the church. But the idea that God created, in his creative love, he created us even knowing we fail, and in his redeeming love, he came to redeem us even knowing that some would not receive that, and in his sanctifying and glorifying love, he will take many of us home to him, even though he knows that there will be some who will not go home to him because they did not answer any of the calls that he issued from any of the persons of the Trinity, the way we were made, the way we were redeemed, and the manner in which we're sanctified and glorified. So it's quite possible, just as human beings do with multiple intentions but for primary purpose, for God to express love through the redemptive act, with the emphasis being on that love, but it's satisfying a number of other conditions as well. And that's the way I would look at it if I were to try to reconcile the disparate theologies that have been expressed over time. It would be that in loving us enough to become incarnate, the second person of the Trinity loved us enough to pay the ultimate cost of as the recipient of the misguided zeal of the Jews and the bloodlust of the Romans and the Gentiles, if you will. And in doing so, that love redeemed us. Did it pay a debt? Did it create a bond between God and man? Reconciling man with God? Is reconciliation part of that? Clearly, because what is the first thing Jesus said on the night of the resurrection in appearing to the apostles? Peace be with you. Now and then I send you out. Whose sins you shall forgive, they are forgiven. Whose sins you shall retain, they are retained. And he gave them the Holy Spirit for that purpose. So the act which brought peace between God and man, restored the communion between God and man, was the ultimate act of love of God for man, and was given to the church that it could bring that act of love of God for man leading back to God down through the ages to all places. And this is what baptism does. It's what the sacrament of reconciliation does. The Eucharist is the bond of communion between God and man that was restored through that act of love. So I think you have to look at it more universally as coming out of God's motive of love in redeeming us. A, B, C, D, E, F, these other things were accomplished. Not because he had a checklist and said, now, okay, how am I going to substitute for sin over here and do this other? No. He loved us according to the nature of divine love, and in doing that, he accomplished all the other things beside in the magnificence of that act of love. That's the way I look at it, and that's not terribly complicated to love. I think, to understand, trying to break it down on the nitty-gritty is you can do that. Intellectually, we can do that. But God is ultimately a simple nature, a simple substance. And so we look for the simplest explanation, and John the Apostle gives it to us. God is love, and he who abides in God abides in love, and love in him. And I think it's out of that love that he redeemed us and accomplished all the rest beside. I hope that's some satisfaction, maybe not.
No, that actually helps a lot. Thank you very much.
Okay, David. Thanks for calling in. Good question, though. Well, let's go to, let's see, we've got some YouTube questions here waiting for us. Jose asks, if Jesus gave a primacy to Peter in Matthew 16, which was done in the presence of the other apostles, why do we see them arguing about who'd be the dreamers or asking Jesus if they could sit on his right hand? Well, because the church was not yet, and short of infallible declarations of teaching and acts of governments requiring obedience, the apostles are every bit as human as the rest of us. and as the church leaders have been down through the time, and the church pew sitters as well. So what Christ gave to Peter on that occasion, and then after the resurrection when he said, Peter, do you love me 3 times, and then, feed my sheep, is to give a point of unity for the apostolic college. That when the ultimate decision of the faith is needed, or the ultimate decision of the governance is needed for the common good of the church, there would be somebody to do that. It's an analogy to what he does, what he himself did. This is the symbolism of the keys of the kingdom. The keys of the kingdom were what the major domo, or you might say the prime minister or the treasurer, whatever title you want to give to it, who the king of Israel committed his authority to him, and he ran the day-to-day administration of the kingdom. This is what Peter does for Christ. It's Christ's kingdom. He's responsible to Christ for that kingdom. He has a stewardship of that kingdom. He has the keys of that kingdom, but he's not the end of the kingdom. Christ is the end of the kingdom, end in the terms of goal and objective, the omega point, if you will, to put a scriptural turn of phrase on it. So this is what the role of primacy is. And we were just talking about love, which is sort of interesting because in the first post-apostolic reference to the Petrine ministry in the writings of St. Ignatius of Antioch about 107, when he was writing to the 7 churches, analogous, I guess, to John's own letters or reference in the book of Revelation. In writing to Rome, he refers to it as not the presidency of the truth, but of love, of charity. Because again, as I noted earlier, charity is the objective. Truth serves that. Truth is necessary to have a rightly ordered charity. But ultimately the goal is communion with God, and ultimately the goal is communion of charity within the church here on earth. So the role of the truth in that is clear, but and the primacy is ordered to that, but it's also ordered to the charity, the bond of communion that's expressed through the governance of the church, and you might even say the tolerance in mercy and with the objective of reconciliation that the church has, even for sinners, so that an excommunication, for example, is meant to be medicinal and not simply retribution for wrongdoing. Because always love is supreme. The salvation of souls is the highest law of the church, as the very last canon of the Catechism tells us. So this is what Peter's primacy is directed to, the salvation of souls. And in doing that, he has a presidency of charity, a visible one, because an invisible one is insufficient. You need only look at the disorder in the Protestant world to see that. And even among our Orthodox brothers and sisters who can't maintain communion among the various churches of Eastern Orthodoxy, you need that primacy of communion, and you need the charity, you need the primacy of truth as well. And so this is the role that Peter has and exercises. Okay, let's take another question here. Oops. Trying to zoom out on my monitor here. Okay, so we'll go to another YouTube question, I guess it would be. Marlene asks, if the gates of heaven were not open yet to souls, how did Moses and Elijah with Jesus at the Transfiguration? Okay, these were the spirits of Moses and Elijah. They would not have been coming from heaven. But They would have been coming from the place of the dead. Remember, there's the story of the how, was it Saul, I believe, went to the witch of Endor and asked her to conjure up, to divine the prophet Samuel. He wanted some information, I guess, about why things were going so badly for him. And so Samuel came and said, "Why did you do this?" Of course, it was against the law God had given to divine people from the dead, as it still is. So they were there. Their spirits were there. They were potentially capable of communicating with the living. Here, there's an example from the Old Testament. And Moses and Elijah would be an example also of a different two just individuals of the old law who were waiting in the bosom of Abraham, waiting in the limbo of the patriarchs, as Catholic theologians call it, for the Jesus entry into heaven. And of course, they specifically were brought up is because they are the authorities of the old law. Moses, who came on Mount Sinai, and of course Elijah as the greatest of the prophets who worked so many miracles, and so therefore they are fit witnesses to the apostles, Jews themselves, members of that old covenant themselves, that Jesus was the Christ. And so that's why they would have been brought up. Okay, let's take another question here. Nathaniel asks, is there valid historicity behind the oft-asserted claim that the Church has formally taught geocentrism doctrinally? Can doctrinal teachings be abrogated, changed significantly? Thank you in advance. No, the Church never formally taught geocentrism. It's different from maybe a pope defending that position. But let's look at history and see how this came up, because everyone thinks of the Galileo issue. What happened there? The Ptolemaic view, the Egyptian Ptolemy and his view of the universe with the Earth at the center and the planets on shells, including the sun and the moon being on shells at a distance from the Earth and revolving around the Earth. This was their scientific conception of the day. And the Polish astronomer or priest Copernicus had come up with the idea of heliocentric, or the sun at the center of the solar system at least, and probably would have conceived that as the center of the universe as well, us not knowing anything other. That's what he stood up for, and the Church stood up for the science of the day. The biggest recalcitrants to accepting Copernicus's and Galileo's views of things were the astronomers of the day. They were the ones saying that Ptolemy's view was correct and Copernicus's view was not correct. The Pope just stood by them. And maybe in all of that, there's an analogy to climate change today. The scientists can get it wrong. The scientists of that Galileo's day were wrong and Galileo was right. Who knows what that means for climate change, but it does mean that when the Church speaks on science, it doesn't do it with the authority that it does with respect to truths about God, the Church, and the faith. God bless. Until next week, have a good Easter week.